Greetings, everyone. Welcome. My name is Gordon Mitchell. I'm the director of debate here at the University of Pittsburgh and an associate professor in the Department of Communication. I want to thank at the outset some key people who helped make this event possible here at the University of Pittsburgh, including Don Egolf, Peg Chalice, Trish White, and the offices of the provost and the dean for their ongoing support of the William Pitt Debating Union. I also want to extend an official welcome on behalf of the American Forensic Association to our visiting debaters from Britain. And let's actually give them a hand, first of all, and welcome them to Pittsburgh. They are participating in a tour that is sponsored by the Committee on Discussion and Debate, which is an organization that is supported by the National Communication Association and the American Forensic Association. Their tour takes them to 25 different debates in 16 states, and they're 3 weeks in to their tour. The organizers of this tour began the tour by holding them for 8 straight days in Missouri. So our guests come to today's forum with some first-hand knowledge about some aspects of U.S. detention policy. Now, after Missouri, their next stop was in California, and they took a short trip across the border to Mexico, where they were serenaded by a mariachi band in close range by their table for 1.5 straight hours while eating fajitas. So they left California in this early stage of the tour with a mixed bag. They definitely picked up a wicked Arnold Schwarzenegger imitation, which I heard a small sample of last night. You may be able to coax that out of the speakers today. But also a slight touch of laryngitis. Now, luckily for us, Kenny Fleming's laryngitis has subsided and his voice has recovered. So he's back at full strength for this debate. And let me introduce Kenny Fleming and tell you a little bit more about him. Kenny is actually seated closest to you. He recently graduated from Glasgow University, where he was a star of the Glasgow University Union, winning the Scottish National Debating Championship in his senior year. So in addition to being an actual debater for the Glasgow Union, he was also a convener of debates. And so that means it was his job to actually organize the debates and bring people together for events such as this in Glasgow. And as he was describing what some of these tours of convening the debates entailed, he was telling me that the debating hall in Glasgow is actually associated adjacent to a dance hall and a pub. And so he's used to dealing with rowdy audiences, you can imagine. And that's one of the traditions of British parliamentary style debate, is that the audience not only gets involved in questioning, but also in heckling. So feel free to make Kenny feel at home today. If you feel like you're hearing an argument that you like, that you approve of, go ahead and tap the desk. Go ahead, try it right now. Try tapping the desk. Okay, that sound is probably is music to Kenny's ears. It's the English nationality room. It's not exactly the Scottish nationality room, but it's close enough. We do have a Scottish nationality room. And I'm learning about, Glasgow. I put in a request to have a keg of beer and a rock band to come as part of the request. The nationality room authorities turned that down, though. So we ended up here in the English nationality room, which is somewhat fortuitous because this room is actually modeled after the original London House of Commons. And believe it or not, this room contains more original material that was salvaged from the original House of Commons than any other place in the world. The original building was destroyed in 1941. And so you can see the configuration here of the rows of chairs is designed to simulate the way the debating chamber is set up in the House of Commons. The story goes in the House of Commons, the rows are arrayed against each other close enough to where the opposition speakers can hear each other, but far enough away that their swords can't actually reach across the aisle to touch the opposition. And so some nice touches here in the English nationality report today. So let's give another welcome to Kenny Fleming from Glasgow. partner is Sean Owen. He's from Dillon Thomas Country in South Wales. He hails from Carmarthenshire, where he was educated at a local Welsh language comprehensive school. He then went on to study law at Lincoln College and Oxford University, where he also traveled extensively with the Oxford Union on debating trips. Sean's family includes a number of Welsh socialists who enjoy nothing more than bashing American foreign policy. So you can guess that his creative powers might be tested today, being on the opposition side of the motion that this House believes Gitmo has got to go. While at Oxford, Sean was also president of the Liberty Group, which is a student organization that is basically the UK's version of the ACLU. And so please don't let the arguments that you hear from him today get back to his friends in the Liberty Group. Extend him that small courtesy. But I think that you will be fascinated to hear how these fantastic debaters actually are able to interpret a motion and produce an interesting debate on such a controversial topic, even though some people may think that it's difficult to oppose such a motion. So let's give a hand to Sean Owen. So that's the opposition side. They are going to oppose the motion, and their opponents will be the proposition side. These two good-looking gentlemen right here. First of all, closest to you is Stephen Llano. He attended Texas A&M University, where he helped found that school's National Parliamentary Debate Association debate team back in 1998. Those of you who remember the 2004 presidential debates may be intrigued to know that when Steve left Texas a few years ago, he took the state's entire stock of oratorical talent with him. And he went on to Rochester University and the University of Syracuse, where he earned a Master's of Arts in the field of communication. Currently, he's a doctoral student at the University of Pittsburgh's Department of Communication, and he owns a ferret whose name is PP, who is almost completely blind, whatever that's worth. So let's give Steve a round of applause. Steve's opponent, his partner here on the proposition side, again, answering the motion, defending the motion, saying yes, this House believes that Gitmo has got to go, is Damien Pfister from the University of Pittsburgh. Damien earned his MA from the University of Pittsburgh in 2003, and he's currently completing his doctoral coursework, which features study of public argument, and particularly the blogosphere, blogs. Last year, he served as the acting director of debate at the University of Pittsburgh, and as an undergraduate debater for the University of Alabama, he reached the elimination rounds of major national tournaments, including an appearance at the semifinals of the 2000 Cross-Examination Debate Association National Tournament. He grows his own herbs in his backyard, and I think that you'll agree, after hearing him speak, that he truly is an organic intellectual. Let's give Damien Pfister So today's motion, this House believes Gitmo has got to go. You probably know that Gitmo is the U.S. military's official acronym for Guantanamo Bay, so-called Camp X-Ray, that was used to hold many so-called prisoners of war following the 9/11 inspired war on terrorism launched by the Bush administration. So we're going to be talking today about U.S. detention policy, about trying to strike a balance between national security and individual liberties. And before we get to the arguments, just a small tidbit about the role of U.S.-British relations. It's quite interesting. During the Revolutionary War, in 1780, there was a British Army major named John Andre who was convicted and hung by a military tribunal ordered by George Washington. And the circumstances of Major Andre's plight and subsequent execution in the United States bear on today's topic, because he was a British soldier who snuck into the United States as a spy carrying dynamite. He was planning on collaborating with Benedict Arnold, and he was not wearing an official British soldier uniform. And those facts were key to George Washington's successful case, arguing that he should be executed, and he was. And so in this country, we actually have jurisprudence stretching back to even relations between these two countries, between the U.S. and Britain, that carve out some unique kind of legal loopholes that can open the door for unique kinds of detention policies when confronted with the circumstances such as major arguments. The format of the debate is quite straightforward. You can see it printed on the back of your program. We'll have opening speeches by each speaker. First of all, we'll start off with Damien for 6 minutes. Then the first opposition speech will be from Kenneth. Then we'll hear, coming back on the other side, a proposition speech from Stephen. And then finally, the second opposition speech from Sion for 6 minutes. I will be watching the time here up in the chair. When I knock 1 minute into the speech, that means protected time is expired and the opposing team can rise to ask a question in the middle of the opponent's speech. And the speaker who's at the podium has the option of taking the question and answering it during the speech, or they can turn it down. So you'll see how the British style of points of information work in this opening stage. Then we'll move quickly into the second stage, where you get a chance to ask questions to the speaker. And I'll talk a little bit about the format there when we get there. And then finally, we'll have closing statements, 5 minutes first from the opposition by Kenny, and then Damien will close the debate with a 5-minute proposition summary. So remember, this is designed to be an active audience debate, and of course, Kenny's experience in Glasgow, we want to simulate as closely as possible as we can the experience of an audience approving of arguments that they like by tapping on their desk and hissing when they hear things that they may not approve of. And also, as you're listening to these arguments in the opening phase, keep in mind questions that you might want to ask. And it seems like we've got some competing discourse out there. Can we close the door? I think that might be good, so that the audience can concentrate on the questions. If you do have to leave during the debate, go ahead and just try to make it as quietly as you can. I understand some of you have 4 p.m. classes, but don't worry about that too much. So without further ado, let us welcome up to the podium the first proposition speaker for a 6-minute opening speech, and that is Damien Pfister.
Waterboarding, stress positions, mock burials, disrespect for the Quran, use of dogs to exploit detainees' fears, simulated sexual positions, and a whole host of practices designed singularly to degrade human dignity. As if humans were sponges that if we just squeezed them hard enough, little drops of information would come out. These practices have come to define Guantanamo Bay, and Guantanamo Bay has come to define the United States. Guantanamo is more than a place, it's a state of mind. It's become a code for a whole set of practices that have been exported to places like Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And we've all seen the visual confirmation of Abu Ghraib, the man standing in a box with electrodes attached to his genitals. And we've all seen how that has undercut the perception of the United States in the world's eyes and has hurt international cooperation in the war on terror. Steve and I believe that Gitmo has got to go. That Gitmo is undermining the war on terror and is undermining the struggle against terrorism and extremism in the world. We have 2 points to support our cause. Our first point is that Guantanamo Bay and Gitmoization is not actually producing the effective intelligence that the proponents say it is. Let's remember here that people are innocent until proven guilty. And the presumption that they are guilty until proven innocent is reminiscent of the worst excesses of Stalinism and Nazism. Now, many detainees have no connection to terrorism whatsoever. In fact, hundreds of them have been released in a tacit admission by the U.S. military that they were, in fact, wrongfully detained. Why were they wrongfully detained? Well, as one example, in the Afghanistan war fought after 9/11, the United States military offered a $5,000 bounty for any Afghani who turned over a terrorist suspect. Now, you may not have been to Afghanistan, but you could probably imagine that $5,000 would get you a pretty long way. Absolutely.
If so many people are being released, doesn't this mean that the system is efficient in sorting out guilty and innocent?
Perhaps. But it also signals that there are a number of people that were innocent that are being caught up in this web. And the fact that they don't have much legal representation, the fact that they're not being processed through the court system, means that the system of checks and balances that we have to gauge people's innocence is being compromised. And when people are turned in simply because they're a cab driver and an Afghani, someone in the Northern Alliance who was part of our allies fighting the Taliban, they turn in a cab driver or a farmer simply because there was a battle around it. They say, oh, they're a terrorist suspect. Cash in on their $5,000 and go. Gives us the suspicion that many of these people here are innocent and not guilty. More fundamentally, though, and I think I'm going to get to this more fundamental point before I take your question, torture simply does not work. For example, in the Korean War, many US soldiers were captured and they were tortured and they confessed to crimes that they literally could not have committed. Every significant psychological study in the 20th century suggests that people end up confessing to crimes they did not commit simply to make the interrogation stop. Now imagine if I closed these doors and said that I would not let anyone out until they admitted that they had cheated on the university exam. Many of you might say, well, okay, I'll admit it, I'll take my lumps and get on with the rest of my life. Some of you may be stalwarts, though, and say, no, I will not lie just to get out, something just to expedite my departure from this room. And then Steve and I would have to be forced to take more extreme measures. Perhaps we would sing a couple of the Spice Girls' greatest hits in order to torture you into confessing. And I suspect that many of you would start confessing quickly. And if you don't think that you would confess, then you haven't heard Steve and I sing. Secondly, Guantanamo Bay and the practice of Gitmoization actually increases the risk of terror 2 ways. First of all, it is the most effective propaganda that Osama bin Laden and terrorist leaders have ever been handed. And it reduces international cooperation that is necessary to fighting terrorism. There is a fundamental misconception in the war on terror when George Bush stands up and says, they hate our freedom. No, they don't hate our freedom. Maybe some of them do. More fundamentally, they hate our policies. They hate the fact that the United States has put economic sanctions on Iraq in the 90s that were responsible for the death of 500,000 children because of denial of medicine. They hate the fact that Iraq gets targeted, that there's a perception that the U.S. only bombs Muslim countries. They hate the fact that the United States always sides with Israel in the Israel-Palestine conflict, that the United States supplies Israel with helicopters that say, made in the USA, that are then used to bomb Palestinian towns. But now, they have another weapon in their arsenal, another way to feed hate. They point to the images of Abu Ghraib. They point to what we don't even know is happening in Guantanamo Bay. And they say, this is confirmation that the United States is corrupt, that they have a fundamental disregard for Muslim lives, that yes, in fact, the United States is the great Satan. And so what happens is that these Islamists, these terrorists, these extremists are able to move moderates to more extreme positions. They're able to radicalize people that otherwise would not hate the United States. And that forces, that undermines international cooperation. For example, in the Philippines, there's an Abu Sayyaf terrorist cell there. And the United States is constantly trying to cooperate with the Philippines government in order to take joint operations or have intelligence sharing in order to undermine the strength of that cell. But because the Philippines people, the constituents there, have failed to support the United States, the government feels like they can't cooperate fully. Gitmo is designed with a military exception. This idea that we will break the law if it's militarily necessary to do so. And once we start carving out exceptions like this, then we're eroding the accountability, we're eroding the line between democracy and fascism, and that is why Gitmo has got to go.
Thank you, Damien, for that fine opening speech. The job of the first proposition speaker is to interpret the motion, to develop a framework for the argument. And now we hear from the opposition how they plan to attack that framework. And for the first speaker, I'd like to welcome up to the podium Kenneth Fleming for 6 minutes.
Chairperson, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along. I'm sure after the length of Dorothy's introduction somewhat, we've all got an insight into what it must feel like to be detained. Only kidding, we can treat exceedingly well since we've come here to to Pittsburgh. Indeed, thank you very much for the introduction. He said, here's the guy who's closest to your left. He could have just said, there's the guy who's dressed a bit like a pimp. I'll be honest, this was the only clean shot I had and I forgot my tie, but there you go. You know, don't try and make me feel too much at home, because at Glasgow debates quite often I find myself having pints of beer thrown at me, or even being vomited at a great height. And as much as I'm sure your hospitality is good, please don't, you know. I know actually, you know, we'll be surprised by a lot of things who've come to Pittsburgh, because I'll be honest, Pittsburgh, it doesn't have the most glamorous reputation on a global scale. I mean, you know, it's the steel-making city. Again, doesn't sound like the French Riviera, you know. It seems to have been named after one of the most sweaty orifices of the body. But truly, we've been really pleasantly surprised to see actually what a beautiful city Pittsburgh actually is. And it's good that I could say this in my speech and not lie, because I come out with this same spiel in like Kirksville, Missouri. Yes, Kirksville, Missouri is very interesting, with its farm and its Walmart, and it's got a Walgreens as well. It's like the centre of international tourism. But no, this is genuinely very, very nice. But anyway, on to the serious stuff of the debate. And what's presented to you is what we're going to do is, firstly, Sean and I are not going to stand up here today and defend the torture that happens at Guantanamo Bay. We think of ourselves as adequate debaters, or not quite that good. What we're going to defend today, ladies and gentlemen, is indeed the detention policy. And this is my first point of rebuttal, is that we don't consider the detention policy, the torture, something we have to defend, because that's not US official government policy. Now, of course it's happening, and that's not good, and it's not justifiable, but that's not coming as a directive from the high sources of the Pentagon, from the Secretary of Defence. So as such, I'm not going to defend that. What we think should happen is, you should change the policy, you should improve the practices at Guantanamo Bay, and we do understand there's a distinction between the two. But furthermore, about one of this point he also brought, he said that hundreds of people have been released. Well, firstly, as Sean told you, this shows that there is a degree of sifting through the individuals at Guantanamo Bay. To an extent, British prisoners have recently been shown away. But what we've also seen from Guantanamo Bay is that of those individuals that have been released, 4 have already been recaptured in the war on terrorism. So this actually shows the point that as much as you can adopt a liberal position, you may in fact be compromising the security of the United States. And if we've already found 4 who have already entered ranks and have been recaptured, what's happened to the rest of these citizens that we haven't recaptured is my question. And what we understand is that in this debate today, this is a debate of competing claims. I'll take you just a minute, sir. There's the competing claim of, you know, the right to representation or the rights of those in Guantanamo Bay. But what we think is another competing claim, and what we think wins in this debate, is the right of the United States to protect its citizens. Because firstly, that is the ultimate obligation of the United States government in relation to its citizens. And firstly, as I'm going to talk about and Sean will expand on, because he knows the law a little bit better than I do, and probably he's cleverer than I am, these individuals are illegal combatants, and as such don't have access to a sphere of rights that we, the ordinary citizens or ordinary people, don't do. But finally, I'll take one of the information.
Sure. There's a lot of stuff you talked about there, but 4 people rejoining the war on terror, couldn't their motive be torture even though they were innocent and not against the United States?
Sorry, I missed that.
Well, couldn't their motive be joining up with terror because they were tortured?
Well, firstly, sir, what we've seen is that from the independents is that since they've been recaptured, Mr. Speaker, sir, we know that these individuals are in fact part of the system. You can't get back to Afghanistan and simply be snapped up at a command level of terrorism just like that. That takes time, so it's not happening. The very recapture itself signifies that it was right that they were in Guantanamo Bay in the first place. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, again, we have to balance this question of competing claims. If these people are being active terrorists, again, that's not what the United States government should be doing. But I'm also going to come to this about recruitment policies, ladies and gentlemen. Well, this is just simply wrong, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, on a practical level, ladies and gentlemen, Al-Qaeda, the single most important piece of development in international relations at the moment, is the war in Iraq, ladies and gentlemen. That's how they're recruiting troops, ladies and gentlemen. And singling out, Guantanamo Bay as some sort of recruitment drive tool is absolutely facetious to do so. If you're genuinely interested in the United States government and trying to shut down this recruitment drive argument, then A, maybe you should have gone to Iraq in the first place, or B, you should get out of time. But trying to suggest that that's the recruitment issue debate here just simply isn't true. And secondly, what's the other basis for recruitment? Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't why they're recruiting. This simply isn't about the policies of the United States. This is a war of ideology, ladies and gentlemen. They do dislike your freedoms, ladies and gentlemen. That's the reason that they've bombed the UK. It's also the reason that they've bombed Spain. It is very easy to see what the ultimate aim of Al-Qaeda is. They want to establish a new Islamic caliphate, ladies and gentlemen. That's what they want to do. They want to see a new empire of Islamic law, ladies and gentlemen. And simply pulling out of the Middle East and disengaging there, ladies and gentlemen. On one level, ladies and gentlemen, you might think that's the best thing to do with resources. But secondly, to argue that that's the basis, for active disengagement, ladies and gentlemen, just isn't true. That's not why they're attacking us. That's the purpose of Al-Qaeda. But more second, ladies and gentlemen, what I do want, and this is just to come to the end of my speech, what I want the second individual to address is he's not told us what they wanted to replace it with. Are they actually shutting down Guantanamo Bay as a facility, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, alright, like, if so, where in fact are these individuals going to? If so, ladies and gentlemen, where are these individuals going to go, ladies and gentlemen? Because that's a big question, because you can only criticise the status quo if you think for these individuals you have somewhere else to put them. And is this in fact going to compromise the ultimate security and protection of the United States citizens, which is what Sean and I are going to defend later in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the debate, and thank you all very much for coming along.
Okay, so now we come back to the proposition side for the second speech. In favor of the motion again, this House believes Gitmo has got to go. Please welcome to the podium, Stephen Llano.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're enjoying the debate so far. I, unfortunately, am not as eloquent as Damien, and not as funny as Kenny, but I do have one thing going for me in the humor category, and that is I was educated in the state of Texas, as Owen pointed out. And so one thing I do know about Texas is there are certain ways that we can treat cattle that are effective, ladies and gentlemen, but are not effective when we want to get information to fight the war on terror. And those practices are wrapped up in the ideology that Damien spoke to you about of Gitmoization. Right? This is the ideology. Kenny ends his speech speaking about a war of ideology. Perhaps this war of ideology is linked to this idea of Gitmoization, which I'd like to sort of review here. They say they're not going to defend the torture practices, ladies and gentlemen, but the detention, the policy of the way Gitmo operates, is this exception. It is the military exception that we are against, ladies and gentlemen. We're not against the necessarily closing down of the Guantanamo base. We're against the idea of subverting democratic principles, ladies and gentlemen, human rights, to the idea of information by any means necessary. It flat doesn't work. Remember Damon's analogy of the sponge. The human condition is a bit more complicated than that. It's not as if I want to get information out of my students, many of whom are here today in the audience. They can tell you, I'd love to get the right answer out of them, but I don't throttle them to do it. I make appeasement to them, I make exception to them to make sure that they know there's something in it for them to get the information that I want out of them. And hopefully they won't reverse that policy when they realize they're not really getting their bang for their buck when they see my teaching methods compared to some of the other instructors in the room. So, let's go down some of the arguments that Kenny makes in his first speech of what they're going to defend. They argue that the torture policy is not a directive from the Department of Defense. Au contraire, ladies and gentlemen. Au contraire. Let's look at the response to Abu Ghraib that the director, the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense said about Abu Ghraib. Donald Rumsfeld said, "Why did they have cameras?" That was his response, ladies and gentlemen. The torture was secondary to the idea that it got out. Right? The torture was secondary. The policy to adjust for Guantanamo Bay or for Abu Ghraib or any torturous abuses was, why should the public know about this? The military exception thwarts the democratic ideal. War of ideologies that we can stop if we're against Gitmoization. Sir.
So when we see that you're actually using examples of Abu Ghraib to win a debate about Guantanamo Bay, can you actually make the same comparisons between G-Bay and Abu Ghraib?
I certainly can, because as Damon's pointed out in his first speech, the director of Guantanamo Bay, the person who set up the torture detainment information system there, was moved to Abu Ghraib to shape that prison up to get the information out of Iraqi insurgents to shut down the insurgency. And we see how well that worked, ladies and gentlemen. No insurgency today, right? All those bombings have stopped. It's great. You know, we have this constitution, everything's working. No, ladies and gentlemen, it's still violent over there. It's still bad. We haven't gotten the information we need, and we're just not going to do it when we treat a human being like a sponge that we can squeeze and twist to get the information out of them as we want. They say that many people have been released, and that makes the system appear efficient. And 4 have rejoined the war on terror since that time. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, let me speak to the virtues of having an efficient justice system. I think that's all we want, ladies and gentlemen, is guilty until proven innocent, round them all up, you look like you might have committed a crime, let's round you up, let's make it efficient, we'll question you if you haven't done anything wrong, let's go. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this idea flies in the face of all Western democracy, it flies in the face of all human rights, it flies in the face of the things that we hold most dear, the things that we're attempting to protect. I take issue with Kenny, no thank you. I take issue with Kenny at this time when he says that the rights of the United States are to defend the citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, we have something much higher that we need to defend from that, and that is human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. The freedoms guaranteed to us in the Constitution are what the government is supposed to defend, ladies and gentlemen, not the citizens. Citizens come and go. Rights stay forever. I want you to keep that in your mind when you're deciding this today. What is it that we want to preserve? Do we want just a little bit of information now? As Damien said, the only sort of information that we got from them is that shopping malls are a target. Well, duh! I mean, I think we can all think like this, yeah, shopping malls are a target, but what specific thing have we gotten out of Guantanamo Bay that stops it? What specific thing? Sir?
So, don't you understand that many of the principles that you're talking about, that are orthodoxy in Western jurisprudence, don't apply to these people because they are transnational actors, Mr. Speaker, who have no legal basis to get a sphere of protection you're talking about.
I think that that's a good point, sir, and I think that one of the things we should be doing in the war on terror is holding up a justice system and a system of rights that people can admire and look at because it doesn't take exception to itself. I think the Guantanamo Bay practices and the practices of Gitmoization take exception to those fundamental rights for the purpose of defending our safety. Safety versus rights, I think we can take a high ground and say there are certain moral principles, principles of rights and principles of law that should never be compromised, ladies and gentlemen, in the face of any adversity. Finally, they say there's a better recruiting poster than Guantanamo Bay. That might be true. Iraq might be a wonderful recruiting poster for the war on terror. But consider this: guilt by association. We cannot get the international cooperation we need, as Damien pointed out in his first speech. We can't get that international cooperation if we are guilty by association with the same kind of horrors, the same kind of torture, the same kind of detention policy, guilty until proven innocent. I'm not going to make them defend torture. I think that's probably true. But this detention policy of guilty until proven innocent should be eradicated. We can't get assistance from the people who need to assist us in the war on terror. We can't win this war on terror if we behave in the same manner as the people we claim to be fighting. A final thought, ladies and gentlemen. What should we replace it with, they say? What should be the alternative to Gitmoization? How about the United States justice system? How about the courts of law that we have in Pittsburgh and many other places? How about the prison system? How about the criminal justice system, ladies and gentlemen? What's wrong with that? Isn't that what we're defending here? Isn't that what this battle of ideology is about? There are certain things we shouldn't compromise, ladies and gentlemen. That's why you should vote for the proposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech, Stephen. And now for the second opposition speech, please welcome up to the podium, Sion.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. There's something very strange about this debate. It's having somebody from Alabama and Texas debating the liberal side, and then Kenny from the UK taking the very hard right-wing conservative side in this debate. But we don't mind. We think we've got a pretty decent case on this side of the House. Anyway, what I'm going to be talking to you about is why the US government's primary responsibility is to the security of its own citizens. That's going to be the main constructive point that I'm going to be making during this debate. But first of all, I want to pick up on some of the flaws in the government side today. And basically what I want to be telling you is that their cases rely to a large extent on confusion, on assertion, ladies and gentlemen. And I want to look into this in some kind of detail. Because what we've been told are things like people are not guilty in Guantanamo Bay. That is obviously not true. Let me give you an example of how that's not true. For example, one suspect who was recently held in Guantanamo Bay was recently released to the Spanish government. He was put on trial in connection with the Madrid bombings in an open Spanish court and was subsequently convicted of terrorist activities. So even if it's not the US system that's actually trying people who have been involved in Guantanamo Bay, and held in Guantanamo Bay, then there does seem to be a degree of guilt coming out here. Also, they've tried telling us, well, that loads of people have been released, and this obviously shows that it's not working. Well, I've got two things to say to that. First of all, we've told you, obviously if people are being released, then they're not necessarily holding innocent people there. And in the second place, well, any legal system is going to make mistakes. That's an unavoidable fact of any criminal system in the world. You can't have a criminal system which doesn't make mistakes, which doesn't prosecute the wrong people sometimes, but what we obviously want is that it doesn't do that always. So pointing out a few individual mistakes doesn't necessarily show that the system in place in Guantanamo Bay is necessarily horribly wrong, ladies and gentlemen. And they've tried telling us time after time again, well, you know, torture is bad. And Ken and I kind of agree with this idea. We think that, yeah, it's probably a good thing to say that torture is bad, ladies and gentlemen. But what we've tried telling you time and time again is that this isn't official US policy. The only example that they've given us from this side of the house to try and tell you that it is to say that, well, Donald Rumsfeld once stood up and said that having cameras there was a bad thing. And I agree with him. Having cameras in a high security facility where there's lots and lots of sensitive information bobbing around isn't a bad thing. In fact, I'd say it's far to do with this security issue than anything to do with torture, that his position on this is totally reasonable. So they haven't told us, haven't proven to us on this side of the house that torture is actually an inherent part of US policy with regards to Guantanamo Bay. So basically what we're arguing, or we're debating here, is whether or not we should have this detention facility where people aren't necessarily treated and presented with the same degree of rights as they would be were they to be treated within the US domestic sphere. And we on this side of the house think that it's right to make this distinction between, on the one hand, treating US citizens within the domestic US legal system, and on the other hand, treating enemy combatants in a separate situation who aren't US citizens and treating them differently. We think that's right because we think the US government owes its primary duty to its citizens. Would you agree with that?
Perhaps there are some differences between US citizens and enemy combatants, but do those differences really justify a violation of fundamental human rights?
We haven't necessarily proven yet that there has been a fundamental violation of their human rights here. And even if they haven't got the same protection of human rights that US citizens have, well, simply we think that's the right thing, that's the right situation, ladies and gentlemen. Because we do think that the government owes its greatest duty to its citizens, because simply there's a reciprocal agreement in place between the one hand the government and on the other hand its citizens. Citizens contribute taxes, citizens agree to abide to laws, often citizens of the state will take some kind of pledge. Other people from other countries simply don't have this kind of reciprocal agreement between citizen and state, and therefore they don't have the right to have the same range of rights protections that do citizens of the United States. And it's clear that many, and probably most, in fact, of the people in Guantanamo Bay are foreign citizens. In fact, I think all of them are foreign citizens in Guantanamo Bay. So what we've got here is a situation whereby the US is making this distinction on the basis of nationality. And we think that's right, and that there can be certain security benefits coming about as a result of the US policy. Because while not necessarily always going to get the right evidence coming out of a situation whereby people are being deprived of rights, in some cases we think that there's a potential there for you to get greater information. And we think that's the right thing to do, because we think that what we've got here is a situation whereby we should be leaving the decision up to the US government as to how they should be treating these people and who exactly they should be detaining. Because what I want to tell you is that basically it's very easy for us to stand here without any real specific knowledge of the exact things which these people are suspected of, and to say, yes, we should be protecting their rights. I think it's far better, on the other hand, to simply allow the US government, which is A, specific knowledge, a sensitive knowledge regarding the accusations surrounding these people, and B, expertise and built up knowledge over the years of how to deal with these people. I think it's far better to allow the US government in its privileged position of specialization to actually go ahead and deal with these people, rather than for us to simply stand here in a nice liberal university and to go ahead and say, oh yes, US government, you're wrong. I think that the US government has a far better knowledge base here to go ahead and actually to make these decisions. And also, ultimately, we think there's an utilitarian argument to make here. We think that when you've got a decision to be made, which involves A, on one hand, the protection of US citizens at large, on the B, the other hand, the deprivation of the rights of a handful of individuals who aren't US citizens, then we think that the US government should in fact be going ahead and giving greater weight to the protection of its citizens. A, because of obviously the greater number of them, and B, because of the greater this reciprocal arrangement between citizens and the US government, which I've already pointed out to you. So we think that definitely here the US government should be emphasising the security of its citizens. And we do think that it can actually go ahead and do this effectively. And we don't think, on the other hand as well, that the US is actually this great bastion of rights the proposition of trying to make it out to be, because the US hasn't got, I'm sorry to tell you, the best reputation when it comes to rights, to upholding rights in the international legal sphere. For example, the US constantly receives criticism from Amnesty International, such as things coming from Texas, they should probably have some kind of idea of this, such as the death penalty and overuse of the death penalty, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that for the US to actually go ahead and not present all of the rights which everybody in the international sphere necessarily wants to be upheld is not that bad anyway, because it doesn't even do this within its domestic legal sphere, ladies and gentlemen. So basically what we're telling you on this side of the house is that if you think that the US should be prioritizing its own citizens over foreign nationals, and that it should be prioritizing the security of its foreign nationals, then we ask you to side with the opposition. Thank you.
Okay, now we move into part 2 of the debate, and that is audience questions. So this is a chance for you to get involved by raising a point or asking a question to one side or the other. A small tip about audience questions is that they are best when they're like Valentine's notes. And that is short, sweet, and preferably directed to someone. So if you have a question, say whether it's going to the opposition side or the proposition side, if you have a question, raise your hand. I will recognize you, and then please stand up and state your question loudly for everyone to hear, and then we'll give the speakers a chance to answer your question. So the floor is now open for questions.
Not everyone at once.
Yes, in the back, sir.
To the proposition side, are you aware that the United States and the French government have coordinated counterintelligence efforts in Paris? This has been released in the press. And if you are not aware of that, what do you think that might do to the stated fact that there is no cooperation between counterintelligence?
Yeah. Well, it is sort of interesting whenever the United States and France actually cooperate on something these days. But that's only one instance of where there's some cooperation. And in fact, a number of our fine European critics oftentimes are criticizing the United States for Guantanamo, and they're investing a number of resources actually in investigating allegations of American abuse. This represents a diversion of resources that could otherwise be dedicated to breaking up terror plots. Let me suggest, though, France is not the key ally in the war on terror. It's countries like the Philippines or Indonesia, but some of the Southeast Asian countries that I mentioned in my speech, that are the key allies. And their populations are continually being radicalized because they see what the United States is doing. They see how the United States doesn't value Muslim lives. And it then makes it very difficult for the government of those democratically elected countries to support the United States because they'll just get voted out of office. Thank you for your question.
Another question. Yes, sir, in front.
This is for the opposition. You made 2 points. One, that the United States isn't very good in general at upholding rights, and that there is some kind of a contract between U.S. citizens and the government. Is there some standard of human rights that should be set rather than just a national standard of human rights? And if you could maybe address the two seemingly inconsistent positions.
I think at the moment, human rights do still in the world have a predominantly national face, in that they do differ what are regarded as human rights, certainly within legal systems, differ from country to country. Whether we should actually go ahead and get a more coordinated, more similar form of international human rights protection, and we already have forms of international human rights protection. The problem with them at the moment is that they're generally just not abided to in all countries. I think if we wanted, that they might be a good thing in many respects if we could actually go ahead and get greater unity in terms of human rights protection. But at the moment, that isn't the case.
Another question. Yes, ma'am, in the very back. Yes.
Now that Guantanamo Bay has almost become a big brother scenario here in the United States, the government can use the same detention policies here on their own citizens. So does that really make us safer?
I'm not sure if that's actually the case, that the US government is actually using the same policies on its own citizens within the US domestic system at the moment. As far as I know, the big distinction is that they're classified as being enemy combatants, and that this is if you want, this is the ground that the US is using for exploiting these people, but it's the current legal distinction that's being made. I mean, it's a very messy situation legally, because you do have a situation whereby the international legal system has been directed towards dealing with people from separate countries, whereas with the growth of organized terrorist groups, a significant growth of organized terrorist groups, the legal system doesn't really match up with that. So I can sympathize with the US government to some extent and the difficulties that they obviously face in doing this, in actually classifying people. The big question then is what actually should be the consequences of this classification.
I see the proposition side. Would like a quick reply.
Sean suggested that this was a messy situation. I think that may qualify for the understatement of the century. This designation of enemy combatants is a new legal terminology, one that sort of carves out an exception where law does not exist. And this is what I think your question is really driving at, is once we start carving out these exceptions and we say, oh no, the law doesn't apply to these people don't have human rights, these people we can torture, these people, but then we start to justify the mistreatment of our own citizens. Where do you start saying, no, we can torture, we can detain up to this point, but not after. There's no way to clearly draw lines.
Another question. Yes, ma'am.
This is directed to the opposition. You argue that the torture policy of the United States is not a directive of our government. We have in this country a legal tenet that provides that if one knew or should have known that something is going on, then one can in fact be held liable for the wrong. So it's obvious that one does know or should have known. So I'd like you to respond to that, please.
I don't think that tenet necessarily justifies torture, though, and therefore that wouldn't provide a mechanism for putting torture in place within the US legal system. As far as I'm aware, that would still leave the US legal system in opposition to torture.
I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. I mean, just even if someone was, by their non-compliance and by their apathy, culpable for the policies at Guantanamo Bay, then surely they could still be tried under that tenet of the US legal system by their non-action. There's a difference between direct action and non-action, and surely the non-action, if they were guilty of non-action, they could surely be held accountable under the status quo.
Another question. Yes, sir.
I have a two-part question directed at the opposition. First is that you've done an admirable job of constructing a defense of detention policy in principle, but as far as I can tell, you are lacking any specific evidence in this particular case that the detentions at Guantanamo Bay help our national security at all, other than the mention of 4 people that got rearrested. The second part is you've also made much of this claim that once people are released, and they're released by the hundreds, that proves the system works. But it seems to me that you're callously ignoring the fact that even the people that are released are detained for months at a time in a foreign country, in a military base, and subjected to all sorts of interrogation and deprivation of basic human rights.
I think the issue with regards to the success, that probably we're not going to know very much of the evidence that has actually been brought about, given that by its very nature it's highly sensitive. So that's something which is outside the sphere of debate. That's something I think we're going to have to assume does happen. I don't think there's any stronger argument than that can be made. And I think that's something which we can give to the United States government as the benefit of the doubt in this case. Because as I emphasised, the knowledge, the expertise regarding the circumstances of the individuals who have been here, the fact that they're only holding a handful, the fact that they've released people, I think this all points to, and the fact that they're probably only dealing with guilty or people who are likely to be guilty here, and the fact, of course, that when tried abroad, that people from Guantanamo Bay have indeed been found to be guilty. That's happened in Spanish courts, and therefore I think that it's not necessarily a case where you've got people here who are being held for no value whatsoever. And I think that the fact that people have been held there for some time, if they're not guilty, well, that's unfortunate. But I think that's a risk that we should be taking given the present need for security measures.
Another question. Let's see, let's get someone else who hasn't asked a question yet. Yes, sir.
I guess this is for the opposition too. Since these combatants are not protected by the United States laws, don't you think they should be protected by some conventions of international law, rather than being put in this limbo where the president's lawyers tell them the Geneva Convention really are just suggestions, and that they redefine torture? Aren't there conventions of warfare that should pertain here?
Well, the Geneva Conventions would be the obvious ones to apply, but the issue, of course, is that you're not dealing with people here who are from foreign states. International law is quite an uncertain form of law at times. The US has a long history, in fact, of taking a flexible approach to interpretation. For example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it wasn't actually called a blockade that was put around Cuba, it was called a quarantine, and the reason for that was that if it had been called a blockade, then that would have been an act of war. And so you always had this dressing up of terms in the history of the US legal approach to international conventions. I think there's a weakness here at the moment in that probably in the formulation of the international conventions, Geneva Conventions in particular, which should apply to people who've been captured in foreign soil in situations of war. Well, at the moment they do only apply to soldiers of foreign states, and that's not the case with these people. So there's a loophole here which needs to be redressed. I think the US faces a situation which is legally an awkward situation, and I think given this loophole, I think the US has a lot of flexibility in terms of what it can actually do with these people at the moment legally. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that the US is legally in the wrong at the moment in the way that it's actually treating these people. Whether it might be in the wrong for other reasons, well, that's another question, but legally I think it might have some solid ground.
Another question. Yes, sir, in the very back.
For the proposition, could you speak a little bit about the notion that it might be better if we had Gitmo or Gitmo-like place on American soil instead of in a foreign land?
I think that the question sort of speaks to the point of the ideology that we were talking about, and then do we want an ideology of guilty until proven innocent? Do we want an ideology of let's detain them, there's some guilty parties here, let's bring them out, and then have the system fail and then say, oh, we caught 4 of them again, so obviously they're guilty people there. I mean, do we want that sort of a system of Big Brother style, I think someone was mentioning, or a more dictatorial style of justice? Or do we want to take the opportunity to have something a bit more on the higher ground, or a bit more on a higher level? I'm not sure what it would look like, but I think that this is a key opportunity. Right? And we've already sort of missed a key opportunity in the war on terror with our responses to 9/11, in a sense. It's kind of outside of the debate. But I think this is another key opportunity for the United States to sort of stand up and show the world what it is that we were fighting for. A sense of justice, perhaps worth fighting for, right? He said, Sean says there's a legal loophole. I agree with him. There's a big legal loophole here. But the question is, do we exploit that loophole, or do we use the loophole as a place to take a stand for something that might be a little bit better than what we have internationally now?
Next question. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
To the opposition, you have said many times that the U.S. does not have a legal representation to use, but the U.S. is also using the concept of detaining people who are, in any reason, suspected of possible activity made. And they have that here, and people, with all of us who are protected by U.S. laws and our Constitution, they can detain us under the Homeland Security Act. They can detain any one of us just for walking out that door right now, and for me saying what I'm saying now. They could detain me, take me off, and no one will see me for a month. And they don't have to tell me why, they don't have to tell anyone why. Does that mean that we are, since that policy is going out of Guantanamo Bay and into the United States, how can this ever be a good situation?
I don't think Guantanamo Bay is the necessary cause of any other losses of civil liberties. I think the cause would be a general desire to increase security and for government to have greater powers to increase security. That desire is, of course, both Guantanamo Bay and any loss of civil liberties in the United States. I think they're separate issues, really. The United States government is treating them as separate issues. It's got the domestic sphere, then it's got this Guantanamo Bay approach, it's separate from the domestic sphere. I think that it's possible for anyone to say that there might be damaging consequences of the loss of liberties in both places, but at the same time, I think we should be treating them separately. So while Kenny and I are arguing in favour of the policy in Guantanamo Bay, that doesn't necessarily mean at the same time we're arguing in favour of things like the Patriot Act in the US.
Next question. Yes, sir?
The proposition again, in case you have a quote on how many answers it does, you must give. What do you propose to offer instead of these sorts of techniques that are being used now in the war against terrorism, when those who fight for the destruction of the United States are not abiding by Geneva Conventions and are using asymmetrical warfare to attack private and innocent citizens?
I think that's a good question. I think a lot of times the way this debate gets constructed and played out is that if you critique Guantanamo Bay, if you reject Guantanamo Bay's practices, well, what's the alternative to that? You must want them to just be set free and run around and stuff. You know, obviously that is a false dilemma. We are defending traditional law enforcement, which has been incredibly successful in breaking up terrorist cells and terrorist plots. You'll notice one of the examples that he uses of the person released from Guantanamo, got convicted, provided extra information on the Madrid or London bombings, which only goes to show you that I think traditional law enforcement techniques actually work. What's happened in Guantanamo is that they've created an incentive system where if you snitch on somebody else, you get an extra tube of toothpaste, or you get extra exercise or shower time, you get different amenities. Well, what this has created is an incentive system for false snitching. And so that it forces the US military and people interested in tracking terrorist leads down the wrong paths. It represents another diversion of resources. Paired with torture not really, getting the type of information we need to stop terrorism, I mean, I don't see that there's a particular advantage of Guantanamo Bay over and above traditional forms of law enforcement.
We have time for about two or three more questions. Anyone? Yes, sir.
Can you keep Gitmo and Gitmo torture?
No. Because Guantanamo Bay exists in an excluded area where no law really applies, and as long as the United States refuses to grant these enemy combatants full human rights, then the torture is going to be able to continue to fester. And that's the thing about torture and terrorism, is that it thrives as part of an underground economy. So as long as there's no oversight, as long as lawyers are denied the opportunity to speak with their clients regularly, as long as the Red Cross is denied access to the caging areas where these prisoners are kept, then these abuses are going to continue just because there's no oversight. I think there's a difference between, in principle and in practice. In principle, long-term detention may be a good idea, but in practice, without the types of human rights protections and legal protections and procedural due process protections, these abuses are inevitable. These abuses will continue.
Another question. Yes, sir.
Just as a follow-up, law enforcement is usually a reactionary vehicle. What sort of prevention methods would you suggest?
Yeah. Well, I don't think that's true. I mean, look at the way they built moles into the mafia, and they've released the little fish, or dangled some carrots in front of the little fish so that they incriminate the big fish. I don't think that law enforcement is entirely just sort of reactive. There's lots of proactive things that they can do. And if you can get terrorists to cooperate in ways beyond torture, you can be sure that the information that they're providing is more plausible, is more true, is more useful in the war on terror, or any fight against terrorism.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
Yeah, I think we all know Louis Freeh published this very controversial book about his time as the director of the FBI recently. And in that book, he sort of outlines some of the just basic FBI police work that captured a lot of terrorists and a lot of suspected terrorists. Like, he was sort of trying to operate. In that book, he sort of argues, I mean, it's debatable, like all good things are, but he argues that a lot of good old-fashioned FBI police work captured a lot of people who were attempting to do terrorist attacks or had unofficially declared war against the United States. And then if you look to the 9/11 Commission report, Janet Reno testified that under her tenure as the director of the FBI, or as the Attorney General, she wasn't the director of the FBI, but as the Attorney General, that her meetings with Clinton, they'd stopped between 8 and 11 9/11 style attacks that were planned for the year 2000, just with old-fashioned police work. So I think the burden is on people who would support detainment in Guantanamo to say that this exception is actually necessary in the conditions that we face. And I think it's a difficult argument to make.
Thank you very much, and thank you, audience members, for your excellent questions. I think you've done a nice job pushing this debate along and adding some wrinkles into the argument. We started off with the opening speeches, then we had the audience questions, and now we're moving to the final stage of the debate, which is the closing statements. These are the summaries by each side. And these are speeches that are 5 minutes in length with no interruption from questions by the opposition. So you'll get to hear a 5-minute speech from each side. First starting with the opposition side, and that's Kenny Fleming. So let's welcome Kenny Fleming back into the audience.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Just on your point about Texas humour, remember often when people are from Texas are doing public speaking, we're not laughing with them, we're often laughing at them. Thankfully today wasn't that case. So anyway, first thing is going to go quick. What I'm going to talk about mostly in this summary is classification of detainees, because that's what the debate is focused on mostly. And then just a couple of quick points in practicality. Let's just remember that these people were not arbitrarily grabbed, right? They didn't have some sort of fishing trawler just waving around Afghanistan trying to see who they were. There were procedures within the US military where military intelligence had to provide adequate intelligence, adequate evidence to US command and control procedures that these people could be taken to Guantanamo Bay. And that did happen, and we have to remember that. Furthermore, he also told us this thing about torture and Gitmo, and he said, well, no, actually, torture must exist in Guantanamo Bay. I think if you follow that to a logical conclusion, what he's really saying is that in any US military facility, law doesn't exist. In any US military facility, order can't exist. And I find that an absolutely gross, firstly a gross exaggeration, and secondly an indictment of the US military that isn't justified in this debate nor in any other debates. But more importantly, onto this idea of how do we classify detainees. The lady over there brought this question of the fact that the Patriot Act, I think, was the thing about what we can do, and she also brought this thing about the US Constitution. Well, firstly, here's the difference. The US Constitution exists to protect the United States citizens. These people aren't United States citizens, so they can't expect that seal of protection. Secondly, and I'll come to the other point of fundamental human rights in a minute, secondly, this point, is there any logical or empirical connection between the establishment of domestic legislation in the form of the Patriot Act and what happens in Guantanamo Bay? I don't actually see what the causal relation is there. The second one, and then we also had this gentleman, but more importantly on the classification of detainees. And someone brought the point of the Geneva Convention. Well, let's be very clear about these individuals. They're not subject to the protection of the Geneva Convention. Firstly, because they were performing their actions. They're not soldiers. They weren't wearing uniforms like normal soldiers do, ladies and gentlemen. And secondly, they target civilians, ladies and gentlemen, like soldiers don't, ladies and gentlemen. So they were arguing in non-military activity. As such, they are not subject to the protection that prisoners of war get. And we have to establish that. That's clear. That's clear from my understanding of the situation. And secondly, we have to understand there are also laws, ladies and gentlemen, that apply to the United States to foreign nationals, ladies and gentlemen. Why do they also not fall into this? Because these individuals are not direct foreign nationals in their conventional thinkings. They are actors of a body in the form of Al-Qaeda, ladies and gentlemen. Al-Qaeda and its members have voluntarily and knowingly made themselves transnational actors on behalf of an ideology. Can you tell me, ladies and gentlemen, which statute of international law exists to protect the fundamental human rights of extremists who are acting on a transnational scale? That law doesn't exist, ladies and gentlemen. And why doesn't it exist, ladies and gentlemen? Because human rights exist in a reciprocal relationship between some national body and some citizen, ladies and gentlemen. And as such, there is no national question here, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm all for universal human rights, ladies and gentlemen, people. But I don't actually see where they apply, ladies and gentlemen, or in this. Or to make this a bit more sophisticated, because I think this guy over here looks as if he's about to cry over what I'm saying, is that we cannot simply draw logical conclusions from our normal understanding to these people's human rights. These people are terrorists, and they are terrorists on an ideological scale. They represent ideologies, not nations, and they represent, indeed, ladies and gentlemen, they represent ideologies, ladies and gentlemen. They don't represent nations, ladies and gentlemen. They were acting as terrorists. They weren't acting as soldiers, ladies and gentlemen. And we come to this other point, which is that people, again, have been captured. And we want this to be a debate about competing harms. And we have to think about something over this. Does this House actually value, even if you are someone of a natural liberal mind point, do you naturally value normal Western orthodoxy and the human right it protects for a group of citizens to whom this body of opinion does not naturally apply over, ladies and gentlemen, the protection and the security of your own citizens? Because let's be very clear about what we're talking about. As liberals, ladies and gentlemen, and the people who actually in the room are, we very often forget that the people that we're talking in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, are people who are campaigning for freedom of speech. They are the people, ladies and gentlemen, who want to destroy freedom of speech, ladies and gentlemen, for dogmatic reasons. So when this House comes to its decision, it has to remember, ladies and gentlemen, that the proposition have appealed to international statutes of international law, of which there are none. They have argued for fundamental human rights and the protections that they give, when, ladies and gentlemen, these individuals, by their own actions, have absolved themselves of the protections of human rights as we know and understand them, ladies and gentlemen. And yet again, remember exactly who we're talking about in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. We are talking about the cold-blooded, ladies and gentlemen, the cold-blooded people who use violence and who use terror to destroy our way of life, ladies and gentlemen, and that the people in that room are very likely extremists, and as such, Guantanamo should continue its arbitrary detainment policy. For all of these reasons, thank you all very much for coming on.
So the final speech in the debate will be the summary, the closing statement by the proposition side, a 5-minute speech from Damien Pfister.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our friends for flying all the way from Missouri and Chicago and to Gordon for setting up and organizing this public debate. Definitely a service to the university. I will remind the House, though, that legality does not equal morality. That legality does not equal the most pragmatic policy option. That seems to be what the crux of our opposition's defense is that, look, under international law, these people don't have rights. Right? They're not combined with, they're not connected to states. They don't pay taxes. Well, I'm afraid I have a confession to make of my own. I don't pay taxes either, because I don't make enough as a graduate student in order to actually be taxed by the government. Now, I hope, well, this is just our taxes, I hope that doesn't mean that I should be tortured, because I don't pay taxes. Taxes don't give you rights. The fact that you are human gives you rights. The fact that you breathe, that you love, that you fear, that gives you rights. And this is fundamentally what we're talking about. But even if you show disdain for the Guantanamo detainees, if you don't believe that they have rights, that they are violent terrorists or whatever, there's a very strong pragmatic reason why we should abandon Guantanamo Bay, why Gitmo has got to go, and that is that torture is not giving us any good information. It's diverting resources that could be dedicated towards the war on terror. It's stopping international cooperation that could better be disrupting terrorist plots and terrorist cells. And it is the biggest recruiting poster that Osama bin Laden and Zarqawi and all of these other al-Qaeda leaders can point to say that the United States is, in fact, the great savior. Now, I think that you will agree with me that these legal loopholes in the Geneva Conventions or in international law are justified taking an ethical stand. This is where we, as an audience, can oppose Guantanamo Bay. And they have quibbled a little bit around the corners, saying, oh, well, they're enemy combatants. Oh, well, this isn't official policy. No, this is official policy. General Jeffrey Miller was sent to Guantanamo Bay to extract information from Afghanis. He did. Then he was sent to Abu Ghraib to Gitmoize that prison in the wake of the Iraq conflict. He did. We all saw what happened. There's a fundamental question of how best to reduce terrorism. Let me propose that terrorism thrives in the underground. Terrorism thrives where there is no light to shine on it. And what we need is to shine the light on terrorists. We need to track their financial transactions. We need to develop human intelligence that infiltrates their cells. And we need to put them on trial so that the entire world can see how mistaken they are, how fundamentalist they are, how disturbed they are. We don't achieve that when they're festering in some cell in Guantanamo Bay. The only thing that that achieves is to provide people with material to rumor monger. Right? Well, what's happening in Guantanamo Bay? Ooh, we've seen the pictures from Abu Ghraib. We've seen, ooh, that's bad. And we keep getting hints that there's even worse pictures out there. But we don't even have pictures from Guantanamo Bay. I cannot imagine the type of torture going on there. Law enforcement has had a number of successes, both in breaking up terrorist plots and also breaking up things like the mafia in the United States. Law enforcement is preventive, it's not just retroactive, and it is the best model to pursue the terrorists. There is a certain amount of sort of surrendering of the dignity of a country when we adopt their own tactics against them. This is exactly what happened in Vietnam. We had to burn the village in order to save it. It is needless to say that a burnt village needs no saving. And the question we have to start asking ourselves is what kinds of metaphorical and non-metaphorical villages are we burning with our detention policy? With our detention policy where no light can shine, where the absence of procedural protections increases the mistakes that are made, the innocents that are caught up. But what sort of mistakes will we look back on in a number of years? There is no question that the legacy of Guantanamo Bay and Gitmo will be signed in blood. Now, it's just a question of whether or not we will sign our names in blood supporting that policy. Thank you.
Normally, just to finish up, normally in parliamentary debate there's a vote that is held, a so-called division of the House. I'm going to exercise my chairperson's discretion and defer that to try to prevent the possibility that it seems like the opposition side may have perhaps won this debate, but I would not want Sean's colleagues in the Liberty Group to find out that result. So I'm going to cancel the division of the House and instead ask you to reflect on the arguments that you've heard, judge them in your own mind, and think about them as you attend your classes and reflect on the debate process and the issues that have been raised here and trying to strike this careful balance between national security in the age that we're living in with individual liberties. And so please join me in thanking our visitors and also all four debaters for an excellent
Steve, should I just hit record again?
Yeah.